Welcome to the Linfield University Faculty Lecture Series. I'm Tim Matz, the Domain Serene Chair of the Evenstad Center for Wine Education. It is my privilege and honor to introduce my esteemed colleague, Tony Katrinos, who is one of the instructors in the Wine Studies program, as well as holds a diploma in the Wine and Spirits Education Trust. She most recently hosted 12 students on a tour of the wine regions of southern Italy.
Hi, I'm Tony Katrinos, Instructional Associate in the Wine Studies Department here at Linfield University. I had the amazing opportunity over Jan term to explore one of my favorite regions, the region of Mount Etna on Sicily, Italy, with a group of our students. We got to explore winemaking there as well as some of the cultural history of the area. And I'm here to share a little bit of that with you in this faculty lecture. The Contrada of Mount Etna, among the world's oldest and newest terroir. So we can't really be sure when winemaking began on Mount Etna. We know that by the year about 6000 BCE, humans were making wine on a commercial scale, whether that was for trade or whether just to get the village through until the next harvest of fresh fruits. But by 6000 BCE, they were making wines on a large scale in wineries in the Caucasus Mountains. And it's likely that people living on the island of Sicily at that time might have been making some wine from the wild vines there themselves. Maybe they gathered those grapes, put them in a bubble in that lava rock, and as the intercellular fermentation began in those grapes during storage, and it began to ferment and alcohol was begun to be produced, maybe they drank that wine, enjoyed it, and did it again the next year. We can't be sure, but we do know that around the year 729 BCE, the Greeks arrived on the island, and with them came cuttings. Within a year, they had established former viticulture, former wine growing areas, and were making wine. We know that they brought this more sophisticated form of agriculture to the island, and it quickly spread. It stayed during Carthaginian rule, even somehow survived the Arabs in the early parts of the Middle Ages, and continued well into the times that the Normans took over occupation of the island. Between about 500 and 700 AD, we had writings about Etna wines by Pliny the Elder, who included them in his natural history. They were written by others as well, by Homer, for instance. There became a market developed for these wines based on their population. They were shipped to Malta, especially, also up to the European continent, where the reputation as some of the world's best wines had already been built. By the 18th century, Etna and Sicily had developed a huge export market on the mainland, shipping wines that traveled well because of their power and concentration. Sometimes these wines were fortified. Sometimes these wines were used to bulk up the wines of cooler regions up in northern areas of France or Germany. And then in the 1800s, the phylloxera epidemic, a tiny root louse that had been spread from North America over to the vineyards of the Rhone Valley, then up to Bordeaux, killed off about 50% of Europe's Vitis vinifera vines, those vines that were responsible for fine winemaking. However, Etna escaped. The grapes in this volcanic soil survived because it was very sandy, and phylloxera didn't like to live in such dry, rocky, sharp soils. So the wines continued to have favor. Though things slowed down, and production reached about a drizzle in the 1960s. Even though it was in 1968, the Etna became the first DOC, or the Denominazione di Controllata, in all of Sicily. This is Italy's version of a protected denomination of origin, meaning that the region is defined and delimited for the production of wine because of unique character that we know that we can find in that wine. However, despite being the first DOC, by the 1980s, production in Etna nearly stopped. Originally, it was because of a scandal. Some winemakers making low-quality wine were found to have doctored the wine by adding methyl alcohol, a basically industrial purpose wood alcohol, in order to pump up the alcohol to meet the minimum production value and their profitability. Unfortunately, that killed a number of people, and so the local regulations prohibited the use of the old winemaking facilities, unique facilities called Palmento, that I'll tell you a little bit more about. And at that point, vineyards became abandoned. Though we benefit, because as Italy's wine industry continued to change from the 1980s and 90s, a lot of places in Italy tore out their vines chasing the next biggest commercial thing. They tore out the traditional grape varieties. They planted Chardonnay, they planted Merlot, and then after the movie Sideways, they changed that Merlot into Pinot Noir. However, Etna being not an area of focus, those old vines continued on, and so we have them today. At one point, there were just 3 or 4 serious wineries left on Mount Etna. However, there's been a rebirth, a resurgence since about the 2010s, and it all has to do with unique factors of natural terroir on Sicily and around Etna. So let's talk a little bit about those natural factors of terroir. So first off, what is terroir? Terroir is what we wine geeks like to talk about a lot. It's the unique natural factors of a place where wine is made. It consists of things like the climate, the slope, the elevation, all things that we humans can't necessarily change. It doesn't involve winemaking, it doesn't in fact involve those human practices, but it's those natural conditions. So what is that terroir of Mount Etna? Well, first off, in the basic, it's a stratovolcano. And not only that, it's one of Europe's most active. So as a result of that, we have a number of different soils. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the climate is very important. So in Etna, we're not far actually from the African continent. So it's a warm Mediterranean climate. But because of the volcano, because of that, we have some elevation, which can give us some different climatic zones in which to grow wine. We have unique conditions of winds. So we have the Scirocco winds that are blowing up across. Not only are they bringing dust from the African continent, but they're also bringing humidity in the form of rain that falls on the south and eastern slopes of Mount Etna, bringing a cooling effect to the climate and plenty of water for our viticulture. It also brings snow to the top of the volcano, and skiing is even popular there in winter, though that's higher than we grow grapevines. We have elevation as one of our factors for terroir. So the DOC has codified where on Etna wines can be grown in order to qualify for that Etna DOC label. And because it was written at a time when high altitude viticulture wasn't quite a buzzword in the industry, it actually won't include any wines that are above about 2,624 feet. Though in practice, viticulture goes up over 3,000 feet there. Above that, it's just too cold. We have too short of a growing season, and we just don't get our grapes ripe. But we have this play of elevation between nearly sea level and that 2,600 feet elevation, which gives us a range in which to grow grapes. So we can find some different areas to grow grapes of different ripenesses. The further up we go in elevation, the temperature decreases. I like to use the camping metaphor for this. I always bore my 101 students with this, but it always seems to work. So you think about those days when you're up on a mountain when it's 85 degrees and you're playing in the river all day where it's sunny, but by night, you gotta put on your puffy jacket, right? You got that campfire going. By morning, you wake up freezing and you can't wait to get that coffee ready. We have that what we call a diurnal shift. So elevation brings a cooling in temperature, and especially that diurnal shift at night that allows us to slow down ripening in what's otherwise a really warm climate. So that allows us to grow different kinds of grapes. it also helps us to preserve acidity in the wines, and that's a real key factor in our Mount Etna wines. Also, rainfall increases too, the further up as we go, and on certain sides. That'll bring us a difference in flavor from the wines that are grown on the windward side, where the wind blows toward the mountain and drops the rain, and on the leeward side, where it stays quite dry. Almost most importantly about Etna is the soil. So this is a volcano that is made up of a patchwork of soils, made from eruptions that have happened over about 2,700 years. The most recent of them, probably just a few weeks ago. It's an active volcano. It's continually raining down ash and cinder on the local villages. Fortunately, it's pretty predictable and the eruptions tend to be fairly limited. People have time to get out of the way, but we just don't know. Some of the smaller villages near the top of the mountain could be threatened by the volcano once again. But what this has done is create a patchwork of old and new soils, soils that vary in age over hundreds of years. And we have about 36 different unique types of soil, all within the Etna DOC. And here's the thing, almost all of those are volcanic soils. We have different craters that are erupting at different times on Mount Etna, multiple active craters, and each one emits its own concoction of minerals. Even different eruptions can have slightly different variabilities to it. So the primary purpose of soil when it comes to viticulture is to provide water for our vines. So our real variables here are the depth of soil and the proportion of rock in that soil. So we talk a lot about texture when it comes to that availability of water and drainage. There's very little clay or fine particles here, but instead it's made more like of sand. But unlike sand that's been washed up by an ocean or comes down from a glacier or a river, this is really porous sand that's come from ash from the volcano and pumice from the volcano. It's porous and it's filled with little dips. And each of those little bits can retain water for the plant, especially deep down in the soil. So our real variable here is the proportion of sand to rock. And that changes from vineyard to vineyard as we have these varying flows of lava and eruptions that have happened. The soil might be low in humus and organic matter, but it's really high in mineral. As we walk through one vineyard on the north slope of Mount Etna, our host, Mario Paluzzi, who is the proprietor of I Custodi Winery, showed us his fertilizing magic. He scooped up a palm full of cinder that had showered down on the vineyard from the volcano just 3 weeks before we were there and told us, "This is my fertilizer." There's a lot of research still to be done to figure out the effect of each mineral on the flavor or the longevity of wines, but we know it makes a difference. When you taste the wine from a vineyard area called a contrada, from the wines from another vineyard area, you can absolutely taste the difference. So we know that there's something to those differences in minerals that can change the flavor of our wine from one place to another, even when just separated by a few miles. So another thing that makes a difference is the aspect. What direction does our vineyard face? In truth, from north to south, the DOC of Etna is really only just over 20 kilometers long. But during that 20-kilometer stretch from north to south, the slope can make a big difference. We find distinctly different wines coming from each of the 4 sectors of the mountain. First off, the north slope, and really probably the most exciting wines of all. Now, most of the northern hemisphere, we don't plant on the northern slope because we don't get enough sunshine, we don't get enough heat in order to ripen our grapes. So Etna is really unique in that the north slope is making really stellar wines. So part of that is the rain shadow effect, right? We're in this a little bit drier area. Another part of it is the elevation that we have and that distinctive diurnal shift. So we need sun, but not heat. And where we are, we're low enough in terms of latitude that we're able to get plenty of sun, and we have rock to help retain the heat. Now on the east-facing slope, it's much rainier and it's much cooler. And here's where we have really stellar white wines coming from all around the village of Milo. It's wetter here, but we're at a lower altitude. So we end up with this very beautiful, vibrant white wines coming from this slightly cooler climate. And on the south, we have our hottest side. So we have our wines that are a bit bigger and richer, our red wines that mature just a little bit earlier for earlier drinking. And then we have the west side. But we tend to leave that just to the citrus and olives. It's actually not very good conditions for growing grapes. So another factor here that we might consider is the age of the vines. So we have a lot of research yet to do. Again, science has yet to show us how age of the vines really contributes to the flavor. But ask any of us who've tried thousands of wines, and we will tell you that old vines add something really special to wines. In this case, because of all those vineyards that were abandoned in the 1980s, and because they were varieties that were quite resilient and resistant in the environment there, these varieties were well suited to the environment there, they survived. And these vineyards are beginning to become retrellised, retrained, and taken back over and put back into production. And what we're seeing are some really stunning wines made from old vines. There are many vineyards in the Etna DOC that have vines that are 100 years old. We walked through a vineyard that was last planted 250 years ago. Some of the vines, of course, have died and they've been replaced through a process of layering from a mother plant next to it. But there were vines that have been around, think of it, since the early 1800s. Unreal, really, really magic stuff. They make these more concentrated wines, but very low quantities of it. So another human factor is trellising. So trellising, how we organize the vine for our agricultural production. So if we leave our Vitis vinifera vines alone, it's a vine. It's going to trail along the ground until it finds a tree, a shrub, a branch to work its way up with its tendrils. And its goal is to outcompete all of the rest of the forest canopy. So it will work its way up to the top of any trees in the area to be able to release its leaves, to put its flowers in the sun, and to get its fruit up where the birds can see it and eat it and spread the seed far and wide. So that method doesn't work so well for us for viticulture. So we like to organize our vines in some way. Here in the Willamette Valley, we use something called vertical shoot positioning. You'll see wires and trellis, the vines cut maybe in a T or perhaps in an upside down L shape, and we send those shoots up each year. Etna has its own unique trellising system that isn't quite like we would see anywhere else in the world. We call it albarello. It means the little trees. So we'll have a trunk, and here is where we'll spur prune, and we will take those shoots each year and we will tie them up. Each vine has its own single stake, and we tie up these vines each year in order to organize them, to get them up in the sun. But often we keep them very low to the ground, sometimes not any higher than my knee, so that the warmth of the sun as it warms the rocks can be released back to the plant during the night and help ripen its fruit. Though this method, unique, takes a lot of care. It takes 2 to 3 times longer to prune each vine than that vertical shoot positioning. Another interesting thing about it is each vine being single staked, the DOC rules will only allow the growers to use chestnut stakes. Why chestnut? Because it's one of the only native trees to the area, and so they're working to have only native materials in the vineyard. So here we might see steel spikes and wires. There we just see local wood. A very unique form of trellising our vines, and something that you won't see anywhere else in the world. However, we'll see many vineyards are begun to switch over and do the types of trellising that we would see in the rest of the world. In part, it's a shortage of trained labor just to be able to care for these vines. So one of our other human factors for the Etna DOC, of course, is the grape variety, right? Humans have chosen what variety of grapes, even if we're relying on grapes that have been growing there for hundreds of years. One of the things that makes Etna so special is that it has 3 unique grape varieties that you don't find in pretty much any other part of the world. And it makes the wines have a really delicious local character. So the first of these is a grape called Norello Mascalese. So Norello Mascalese makes up about 70% of all the vines planted in the Etna DOC. It's interesting in that it's a red grape, but it has a very pale color. So we could draw an association between it and maybe Pinot Noir or the grape Nebbiolo for having that light red color. Unlike Pinot, but like Nebbiolo, it has a tannic grip, right? That drying, somewhat bitter quality to it. The flavor leans toward red fruit, things like red cherry, sometimes cranberry, wild strawberry, which makes the wine taste like it's grown in a much cooler climate than you would find on Etna. The grape is unique in that it retains acidity, even in this warm climate. So typically, as the grapes on a vine ripen, the plant will begin to metabolize the acidity in the grapes as it builds sugar in the grape. So we're always looking for that perfect moment in which to pick our grapes when we have the right amount of sugar, but we haven't lost all of our acidity. Why acidity? It's what makes your mouth water. It's what makes the wine make you want to have another bite of food, and the food want to make you have more wine. So retaining acidity is really important. And these grapes do it well in a warm climate. Another great thing about Norello Mascalese is it develops layers and it develops nuances as it ages. So those beautiful red fruits start evolving into things like dried herb, towards slightly meaty flavors and really umami qualities, things like dried porcini mushroom. It gives the wine depth and it gives the wine a lot of character, and it gives it the ability to age quite well for a long period of time. We make wines both with Norello Mascalese itself, but also we'll see it blended. So the DOC rules for making Etna DOC wines require that we have at least 80% Norello Mascalese. It does permit us to use some other things, so that is an option. So another red grape that Etna is known well for is called Norello Cappuccio. So this red grape only makes up about 10% of Etna's planting. And in part, that's because it's a grape that isn't necessarily great on its own, though some winemakers are making some pretty interesting and delicious bottlings that are 100%. In the DOC rules, a winemaker can't use more than 20% Norello Cappuccio in the final blend for an Etna DOC. However, they can make 100%, they can make a blend that's mostly Norello Cappuccio. They just have to label it as Sicily DOC, right? So encompassing the entire island of Sicily, not just Etna. Norello Cappuccio is a natural blend for Norello Mascalese, in part because it doesn't have that same hard tannin, but instead it has this really pretty, sort of fleshy fruit. It's a little darker than Cappuccio, but it makes the wines a bit softer. So it's a beautiful blend with the two. One of the things that makes Etna DOC unique in the world is that it's a DOC that grows both great red wines and great white wines. And so one of the things that I found as we traveled through Etna and tasted in the various contrada or the various regions is that the white wines are equally strong, especially white wines made of a grape called Carcante. So Carcante has been described to me as having electric acidity, right? So this is a white wine with really high acid, but it just has this spark and it has depth. So it used to be just a few of the vineyards, but at this point we're looking about 9% of the vineyards contain Caricante, and I think that producers will be planting quite a bit more. It does best in that cooler, wetter region we talked about over on the south, where conditions are just right for maintaining this beautiful acidity and ripening a white grape. This is a white wine that's really slow to mature, which is unusual for white wines. Most of the world's white wines are meant to be fresh and fruity, just crack the bottle when you get it, enjoy it within a year or two, not something for your cellar. But winery after winery in the DOC showed us Caricante that told us, put it away. These are white wines that really seem to do best with about 6 to 10 years of age, just kind of depending on what you like in the wine. As it ages, that acid softens, but stays lively. And they start developing tones that are more honey. We see that real nuttiness that you might see in a white Burgundy. The wines that really develop into quite beautiful, well-structured white wines. There are other grapes as well, but these three are traditional to Etna and really are showing some really quite fascinating characters and make up the heart of the Etna DOC wines. So today, I left you in terms of history with the fact that production was decreasing. Ever since about 2010, maybe a little before that, production has started up again. But why? So there were just a handful of pioneers left growing wine in this area. And some of them started really looking at what it might take to take that large volume export business and turn it into a smaller volume, but super high quality. One of them was Giuseppe Benanti, and eventually people who worked for him, like Salvo Foti, started investing, started opening wineries, and started showing the world that this terroir can be some of the best. The industry started catching on, I think, in part because of Parkerization, right? This is a joke we make about wine critic Robert Parker, who pushed for these big, rich, hedonistic wines in the 1990s. Led to things like California producers 200% new oaking their white wines, right? Putting it in one new barrel, transferring it to another to concentrate this big, rich, lush flavor. People in the industry rebelled, got tired of getting tired or full after one glass of wine, and instead we're looking for what's fresh. And Etna ticks all these boxes. So we have people who have been in the industry who are really interested in what's next. I've had one of those. Where's my unicorn? Etna satisfied that in grapes that they'd never tasted before, in a place that maybe they didn't know. A lot of people were just interested in having some wines with some great acidity. Etna, its volcanic soils, its ability of elevation, these grapes that retain acidity, well, it checks that box too. Another term that started circulating, indigenous varieties. I want grapes that have been growing in this area for hundreds of years. Etna has that. Another one would be this idea of high elevation. Definitely something that we're finding on Sicily that we don't find necessarily in other wine regions. 2,000, 3,000 feet elevation. It's pretty crazy. Most people growing on the continent of Europe and even the United States were not growing grapes at those altitudes. And finally, like the great wines of Burgundy and Barolo, we're beginning to divide up the terroir of Etna into these little bits called contrada. So contrada are small groupings of vineyards, or maybe even a single vineyard, that we can think of like the Crus of Burgundy or a Barolo, where small differences in soil, small differences in aspect or elevation show differences that we can actually taste in the wines. So I think this probably leaves us all with one last question that you're ready to ask me, and that is, Tony, what on earth do these wines taste like? They're magic. So Etna red wines have this bright acidity that I've told you about, right? That comes from the elevation. It comes from this grape that retains acidity. And it makes it really alive. You have layers of these red fruits, flavors when we're combining these two red grapes that can give us both black and red fruit, structure that comes from the tannin, and this life, right? Wines that can age, that they get more savory, they get more interesting the older they get. We have whites that have that spark. So really quite fascinating wines. But I think really what makes them most special is that if you were to go to that master sommelier or that master of wine, they can pretty much read its mind. They could pick up a glass, giving it a smell and a swirl, thinking back through all of the wines that they've tasted, and they would know from that one taste that this wine comes from Etna. And I think that ability to express its terroir and its origin is what makes these wines unique and special in the world. Thanks for joining this discussion of the Contrada of Mount Etna. I'll be around to answer any questions that you might have.